Canadian post-secondary institutions, colleges, and universities are panicking and have been over the past year as a result of dramatically declining, falling off a cliff, international student enrollment numbers. Now, these numbers have been going down, down, down over the past months and year now, and it's leading many of these institutions to say, we're going to have to lay off thousands of teachers, we're going to have to close down thousands of programs. They say that many of these high-cost programs simply aren't feasible to offer to only Canadian students, and that these international students who have been coming to Canada have been largely subsidizing the expansion of these learning institutions, largely as a result of the higher tuition costs that international students pay. But something huge has changed here in Canada. Not only has Canada changed its international student targets, the amount that they would be targeting, but also it seems, based on the data I'm about to show you, that, well, people just don't want to come here anymore. Based on the Global Enrollment Benchmark Survey, well, Canada's numbers have dropped dramatically. Last year, there was a decline of 27% for undergraduates reported in the last year's survey, and this year, an additional 36% decline, meaning over these past 2 years, we've seen a 53% decline in international student enrollment. And that's just talking about bachelor's degrees. And in this chart that was tweeted out by Daniel Foch, well, we see these numbers right in front of us, with a 36% dip in the past year for bachelor's degrees. And interestingly, also for master's degrees. This is interesting because while Canada has lowered the targets for bachelor's enrollments, we haven't changed anything in terms of the policy when it comes to masters, which also, I think, shows a reflection of demand for coming to Canada to study. Something has changed. Certainly some of this is coming from these reduced targets from the government, with the previous immigration minister making the claim that there was large-scale abuse happening in the international student area, calling many of these institutions diploma mills, not too valuable of an education for the student, but very valuable for the person who is providing that education. We talked a lot on the channel about how in many cases it wasn't the education that was really valuable here. When you were purchasing this education, what was really valuable was the way that getting a degree in Canada would increase your chances of being able to get permanent resident status or future work permits to be able to stay in Canada. So those changes are definitely having a big impact, but I would also argue that, well, as you look at the news and you see the employment numbers, negative employment numbers in Canada, more and more unemployment, especially amidst young people, well, then you got to imagine that there's some kind of just sentiment change as well. Do you really want to go to Canada to get your education, pay double, triple for it, and then have questionable future in that country in terms of your economic potential, or even your ability to get these permits moving forward after you get your degree? Now, we started covering this on the channel a while ago, and here's one thing that I was talking about where many of these institutions were saying, hey, we might need to shut our doors entirely. He says the carnage will be immediate and catastrophic in Ontario colleges, immediate and severe in colleges elsewhere, and slow-moving but severe in universities. Probably 20,000 jobs will be lost. It's not going to be pretty. Something had to be done. It's just not clear that this was the thing to do, is what he's saying. And he threatens that, hey, we're going to have hundreds of program closures, especially high-cost programs in health and trades. These are going to be cut immediately because of these changes. Because the government doesn't fund these programs. They're not publicly funded at these institutions. They've been subsidized for years, but it's going to be a program apocalypse now that the international students are less so in the picture. Now, we were talking about all of that a year ago, and I think my take has remained the same on this. Of course, jobs will be lost from the shrinking of these institutions who can no longer afford to pay as many teachers because there aren't as many students and not as many high-paying students. But it makes me wonder about the whole productivity question here in Canada. And here's how it relates. If there aren't enough domestic students paying enough tuition to support the size of a school or to support the breadth of programs that that school offers, well, then maybe the school shouldn't be that big or shouldn't offer that kind of variety. I think we've got a lot of situations where many of these degrees that people are going into extreme levels of debt for, they're not translating into actual jobs. And if people are starting to realize that and make the decision in their head, make the calculation in their head that it's not a good return on investment for me to go get this education, then perhaps that program shouldn't be offered if there's not the demand for it. Furthermore, if there are less people working in academia and only in the areas that result in people being able to have jobs as a result of that education, well, then could some of these experts who go down this academia road, who focus more on research and teaching, could those very highly trained, very highly educated people make more practical innovations? Would they be incentivized because there are fewer education roles to move in and create a private business to make money off of their research instead of relying on grants and publishing and full-time teaching roles? Could that help with Canada's productivity problem where we're just simply not innovating as much as we could be? Is this too much of a market-focused framework where the demand for education is what determines what education is offered? Does that make for a good situation in your mind? Or is it something where, okay, now as a result, maybe there would be less education options that are close to home for certain people if some schools close down, or maybe that means less emphasis on the arts and other education programs that don't ultimately result in high-paying occupations, but I think are still very valuable to society? There's something not perfect there, but I think you kind of get where I'm going with this. Let me know what you think in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.